Pikë përkrahet nga Flugër, Eriskom, Muji Auto Center.
Mirëmbrëma, sonte në Pikë e kemi diplomatin e njohur për Kosovën dhe për regionin Wolfgang Petritsch, diplomatin austriak, I cili ka qenë ndërmjetësi I Bashkimit Evropian në konferencën e Rambujës, pastaj edhe si përfaqësues I lartë I Bashkimit Evropian në Bosnjë e Hercegovinë. Wolfgang, welcome to the program.
Thank you for inviting me.
We're going to start actually with your career as bridging two epochs. You've started at the Cold War as a young diplomat in New York at the cultural center, the Austrian Cultural Center in New York. You finished your active career in diplomacy somewhere at the end of the Cold War. And now we are in a totally new epoch. What is that epoch?
Well, I mean, you remind me when I'm thinking back. Clearly, Kosovo for me is, first of all, very close to my heart, and it was so much also a very important part of my professional work when I started out almost 30 years ago dealing with Kosovo. And I have to tell you, I didn't know a lot about Kosovo before, although I have studied at the University of Vienna Southeastern European history. I've written also about my PhD about the Slovenian topic of 19th century, but was never so really involved, particularly because I spent most of my professional career either as secretary to the then Federal Chancellor Bruno Kreisky in Vienna, mostly dealing with Middle East. Kreisky was very much involved in the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And then when I was posted in New York for almost 10 years, clearly there were other issues. But in New York, of course, what happened there was the end of the Cold War. So I was there before, and then when it happened, and I came back in 1992 to Vienna, to the Foreign Office. And a couple of years later, then I was appointed Austrian ambassador to Milosevic's Yugoslavia in Belgrade. Clearly, very early on in my job already as ambassador, Kosovo was on the agenda. And then when the European Union realized that actually they need to do something about it, and the Americans already with Chris Hill were dealing specifically with the expanding issue of Kosovo, so the Europeans said, okay, we also need someone to do, and somehow they came to ask me, and this is how I then started to deal with the Kosovo issue more in depth, so to speak. Yeah. A lot of what I have learned is actually via Chris Hill. And of course, I had a very able assistant, Jan Kickert, with whom I believe, did quite a good job in learning, in getting into this evolving situation. But I must tell you one thing which is really very significant. At the time, and there I should say, Kosovo can really consider itself extremely lucky that the Americans really had this feeling they need to resolve the problems of the world. They need to do what the Europeans in Europe were unable to do. Clearly, these were the wars in former Yugoslavia, the wars of secession that were happening, and Richard Holbrooke and Chris Hill was his assistant. They were dealing with Bosnia-Herzegovina, the biggest and most consequential conflict in the Yugoslav wars. And at the time, I still remember when I spoke to Holbrook about about Kosovo when the Kosovo issue became hot, 97, 98. I said, why didn't you guys do something in Dayton with it? Yeah, and of course, at the time, I did not really know how frantically Kosovars were trying to get on the agenda in Dayton.
Yeah.
So that was for me actually this kind of point of departure, to see something which till then, with Rugova, there was a lot of civil resistance, but there was no fighting, no armed resistance around. And then 97, 98, of course, we know, then the war erupted, and all of a sudden the international community was saying, we need to do something. Yeah. So this is, in my opinion, a really missed opportunity. But Dick Holbrook at the time told me, listen, we were so happy that we could get Milosevic in the Bosnia issue actually to agree, so that we simply could not further burden the Dayton negotiations with Kosovo. And I said, well, I understand, but now here we are.
Yes. And here we are, 30 years after, basically in unfinished conflicts. Now, the question that is being raised is, several questions, of course, are being raised, but the first one is, why are we still in unfinished conflict phase? Why is Bosnia an unfinished conflict? Why is Kosovo an unfinished conflict?
That's a good question, and I have been reflecting on this time and again. I've also written books about this because I wanted to really come closer to the real reasons why Bosnia, after 30 years, and this year, 2025, is actually 30 years of the Dayton Accords. Yeah. And of course, also Kosovo, then a few years later, are still unfinished business. That's somehow it's amazing when we think of the big ambitions that existed at a time when the negotiations went between 94, 95, and then up to 99, Rambouillet and Paris and so on. But I think one reason why it actually, why we actually made progress was clearly this unipolar moment of the United States. There was no other big power around.
Okay, let me
in
turn
any way
Sure.
influence or hinder the United States what they should do.
And that's my point. If this was a unipolar world, if there was a lead of the United States, if it had the military political capacity to do so, why was not the business finished? Why is not Bosnia a functioning state? But it was designed not to be a functioning state. And why is the relationship between Kosovo and Serbia not finished in normal conditions? In having normal relationship between Kosovo and Serbia.
Bosnia and Kosovo are in many ways historic examples of the fall of Yugoslavia, the remnants, so to speak. On the one hand, you have this kind of still multi-ethnic Bosnia. So in a way, you could say like a small Yugoslavia, with the three ethnic communities. And then the key word is really ethnic, because the Dayton Accord really focused solely on an ethnic definition of the state. It's three ethnic divisions and definitions. And so therefore, I think this is the core of why it didn't succeed. The dysfunctionality of the state of Bosnia-Herzegovina was already built into the peace accords.
Yeah.
And you have to say that, of course, Dayton had a historic achievement inasmuch as it stopped the war. But it is not a blueprint for a functioning state. You cannot build with Dayton, you cannot build a functioning state. And from the outset, when I was appointed briefly after the war to be the High Representative there, it became clear to me what we need to do is actually expand Dayton. Dayton can only be the platform upon which Bosnia-Herzegovina needs to be built.
A ceasefire agreement on which you build peace.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah? And actually, I'm thinking time and again now on the situation in Ukraine.
Right.
You know, I mean, it is not just about a peace accord or a ceasefire. You need to, at the same time, although this is always very difficult, but you need at the same time also think about how will this accord, how will this ceasefire, how will this peace treaty, will it make possible that this post-war country will stand an opportunity, a chance to develop. And this opportunity so far still Bosnia does not have. And of course, coming to Kosovo, there I believe, first of all, this lucky strike of history that in the situation the Americans actually intervened in a relatively small and obscure country somewhere in the Balkans.
Right.
You know, when you think today, Ukraine, one of the biggest countries in Europe,
wealthiest,
you know,
biggest.
Biggest country, population-wise, square kilometers, enormous country. And what is the ambition of the international community, in particular of the Americans? And I'm not just talking about Trump. Trump is, so to speak, blunt. He says, I don't care about it. But also Biden, who could have probably done much more.
And Obama.
And Obama already at the time. And of course, there were also quite a lot of mistakes made, you know. The Europeans made the big mistakes because there was no strategic thinking around. For the Europeans, Ukraine was part of their Eastern policy. Yeah. But they always forgot to realize that what is for us Eastern Europe is for, and the eastern border of Europe, for Russia, it's the western border of Russia. Yeah, so that was the problem, that this was not really seen. But now coming back to Kosovo, I think the idea clearly was at the time, it's not going to work out to remain within then rump Yugoslavia. The simple reason is, if you apply an ethno-nationalistic policy like the Serbs did, they couldn't even hold on to Montenegro. How could you ask a Kosovo Albanian to remain in a Serb-dominated state if there is no equality?
Sure.
Yeah? And the interesting thing is, I think the Americans were very much aware that some equality, some ethnic equality needs to be established in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Yeah? But this equality was, of course, done in such a way that they each other have blocked ever since 1995. And the High Representative who is there and who is still there, which I am very critical about, because you cannot be there forever and be the chaperone of a country. Yeah. And only the High Representative is the one who somehow does a job. But now it's already too late. After 30 years, this is not possible any longer to have this kind of external intervention. It will not work. And I think the only way it could eventually work, and Bosnia will remain always the weakest part in this Balkans chain, so to speak, is inclusion into the European Union, so to speak, to get the borders down. But then again, I have to add, while this is a probably good idea, it is far from being realized right now.
Or realistic.
Yeah.
Or realistic, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we've spent a quarter of a century of the 21st century trying to sort out the problems of the 20th century in Bosnia, Kosovo, the region. Meanwhile, new problems have emerged, the relationship between Serbia and Montenegro, the identity issues in Montenegro. And this was a relatively comfortable situation geopolitically. Now we have moved into a totally new world in which, on the one side, we have Putin's war on Ukraine, and on the other side of the Atlantic, we have a Trump presidency which is saying, do not count on my security umbrella anymore. You have to build your own. In these uncomfortable times in which Ukraine is also being decided, how much can we trust that this path towards the European Union is actually the path that is going to give results in the immediate future?
I think we really need to fully reconsider European policy for Brussels and the European Union itself, as well as about the idea, where are the borders of Europe?
Yeah.
And clearly, Ukraine is now the contested border. Yeah. And I am afraid that in the end, we'll end up with a Korea scenario there, a new line of division, which in the Cold War divided Germany, will now divide, I'm afraid I should say, Ukraine. So you move Europe, yes, a bit more to the east, but it will be a source of constant conflict. Yeah, and this, in the end, will really do a lot of harm, existential harm, I should say, to the European project of unification. Because what the European Union needs in order to do what is necessary here in the Western Balkans, which I do not consider enlargement. I say this is consolidation, because the Western Balkans is surrounded by European Union member states, is surrounded by NATO countries. Some are already in NATO and so on. So security-wise and also geopolitically, this is part and parcel of the European Union. Yet, because Brussels is simply unable to get its act together internally, it's the view of the Western Balkans is procrastination. Yeah, but yes, eventually you will
do it. Yeah.
You will come in. Yeah. So this kind of Balkan saying biche biche, it's gonna happen. Yeah. It's gonna happen sometime, but we know that.
And it's the Ottoman avash avash.
Yeah. And this is the worst, of course, the worst situation, because people do not know actually. Now, so far, up to Trump, it was in a way, okay, there was always the big guy in Washington who called the shots also in Europe in many ways, yeah, and it's gone all of a sudden,
Okay, let's continue this part of the conversation. If we are going to have an unfinished conflict in Ukraine, if it's going to be a continuous line of friction between the West, whatever the West is right now, and Russia, does that mean that we will have a repetition of these frictions along the Serbian-Bosniak line in Bosnia-Herzegovina, or Kosovo and Serbia? Because for the first quarter of this century, the Kosovo-Serbia border was actually a line of friction between NATO, the EU expansion, and Russia very successfully using Serbia, preventing consolidation of EU NATO policy here. Is this going to be repeated for the next quarter of a century?
I think there's never a repetition in history, but there are similarities. Yeah? I do not believe that these contact lines or lines of friction will just wither away. They will remain in one or another form there. Whether it's going to get worse or better, it's not the time right now to decide on this. Of course, if you're optimistic, you could say Europe finally needs to get its act together and act, not just react.
So if we're going to translate this as a policy, integration of the Western Balkans is a geopolitical necessity of the West if it wants to prevent Russian influence in the region, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. And if it tries to do it with the tools that it has used already, the result is going to be the same, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. I think, and you have given the key word, which is now so important, that this is what Brussels has already realized. The integration of the Western Balkans is now a geopolitical necessity. It is no longer this kind of enlargement as ever has been done in the past. We need to see now this region in a very different way. It has different functions now. Yeah? Clearly, I mean, it is still the integration into the European Union is an important part, and that needs to happen. But more importantly, right now, and probably for the foreseeable future, is also to say, okay, I mean, how do you eliminate external influence, bad influence from Russia in particular, but of course we also have China here, we also have Turkey here, we have the Gulf states here. This is per se not the worst situation, but it needs to be regulated, and you need to put the Western Balkans on a stable ground, on a stable platform, and the platform, of course, is the European Union. So the geopolitical impetus is the one which really counts right now. But I have to add, I don't see in Brussels the political will. Yes, there is rhetorically, they are speaking and talking and discussing how important the Western Balkans is, and we need to see to it that that Russian influence, in particular malign influence, needs to be fenced off. But nevertheless, it is not really. I do not see really concrete, specific steps into this direction.
Yes, yeah? and then Europe is. I mean, we always speak of Europe, but Europe does not have a telephone number, as Henry Kissinger said famously. But the question is this: Europe is also a changing norm, if you will, because now we have, for the first time, a stronger push towards the far right, as witnessed in your own country, and this might be the path of the next decade or so, right? So how is this going to be translated into the Europe that we want?
This is the paradox of the situation right now. While already for quite some time we have this tendency of a renationalization to bring back from Brussels responsibilities that were delegated in the past to Brussels, this kind of unification, integration impetus. Now it goes exactly in the opposite direction, and this is clearly the goal and the agenda of the hard right. Yeah, and we do see not just in individual countries, but basically in the Western world and beyond. Think of India and Modi, this Hindu nationalism there. So you have a resurgence of nationalistic tendencies, and that, in a way, now produces a situation where the Balkans nationalism becomes normal, so to speak. So we, instead of Europe moving the Balkans or the Balkans, the Western Balkans, closer to the European Union, actually Europe mentally, politically, is moving closer to the ethno-nationalistic identity idea of the Western Balkans, which led into the Yugoslav War.
Paradoxically, the only two factors that may lead to European unification are Trump and Putin, in their own way. Putin by threatening Europe.
Absolutely.
And Trump by saying, if you guys don't get your act together, I won't defend you, right?
Yeah. I think that there is a long history of crisis in Europe, which in the end led to a deeper integration and moving closer together. However, that was at times when populism, right-wing nationalism was not that strong as it is now over the past 10 years or so. That's the difference, you know. So you have these opposing an opposing situation. On the one hand, there is an absolute need for further integration to Europe, the European Union, to become more state-like, yeah, political integration, social integration, and all these big steps, defense integration, of course. And on the other hand, you have now actors in the European Union who want the opposite. Yeah. So how this is going to play out is going to be very difficult. And I tell you one thing: when thinking of integrating the Western Balkans taking into the European Union, we need to ask ourselves, and this is a very sobering idea actually, which strand in the European Union would the accession of the West Balkan Six actually strengthen? The liberal democratic or the Orban threat? Yeah, that's something which we really need to take much more seriously. It's never been discussed. It's always we talk about, well, you know, they come in, you do the reforms, and then you will end up there. But can you imagine if now with Orban and Fico and then let's say whatever Vucic and other strong men in the region would see. I also don't exclude Kurti, of course, you know, just from the political personality here, although this is a different story, definitely. But what would that mean? You know, you would strengthen this illiberal, authoritarian situation in the European Union and achieve exactly what both Putin and Trump want to see in Europe.
Yes. And so the argument, I mean, we push further this argument is, if you were asked honestly to advise one of the presidents and prime ministers who is claiming that his country will be, of the Western Balkans, that his country will be in the European Union by 2030, if you gave them an honest assessment, what would it be?
I'm not sure what will happen, actually. It will very much depend on the reform ability and the resistance and of the European Union. You know, I think what the European Union, what Brussels needs, is a really thorough reform of its institutions. It cannot go on in, let's say, decision making. You still need, in all the foreign policy issues, you need unanimity. And there comes Mr. Orban and says, I'm against it. And everything comes to a scratching halt. And then the Commission hands out some millions to Orban, and then he says yes. So it's a mafia-like situation, yeah, which of course cannot lead to a stronger European Union.
If you had one of the candidate countries from the Western Balkans functioning at the same or even higher level of democracy and state functionality than Bulgaria or the Czech Republic, would it be in the European Union by 2030?
I think you cannot just see this kind of one-sided approach, which is understandable on the part of the candidate, particularly of civil society in the Western Balkans, to say, why don't you take us in? Let's
say Montenegro is a functioning democracy, functioning institutions at the same or higher level than Bulgaria, or at the same level or slightly lower than the Czech Republic. Would it be a member of the European Union by 2030?
But unless the European Union, unless Brussels reforms and brings up a more efficient decision-making institutions, and then unless this happens in Brussels, it will not be possible.
So evidently it's not only a Western Balkans problem.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, I think it's really more up to Brussels and, of course, to the member states to reform itself in such a way that it becomes more functional. We're talking about dysfunctional Bosnia. Sometimes when I watch Brussels and the heads of state and government to take decisions, it reminds me of Bosnia. You know?
So it's interesting that we have now the European Union wanting to deal with Gaza, the European Union wanting to deal with Ukraine, angry why it was not invited into the talks about Ukraine. But it spent a quarter of a century not being able to sort out Bosnia and Herzegovina or Kosovo and Serbia.
Right, I fully agree. This is really why I'm quite concerned about the integration process, about the Western Balkans. How what has changed in Brussels? Nothing actually. The decision-making process is still about the same, and we cannot count on that. After Orban, somebody else will come and he will be nicer. On the contrary, you have mentioned the Czech Republic. The next elections in fall might produce a similar situation as we have it now in Slovakia already. So the trend that you addressed at the beginning of our talk is really now taking shape, and particularly in the eastern part of the European Union. In the eastern part of the European Union, of course, there's also Poland, and Poland is a front state against Russia. Yeah. So you have actually, as a focus, you have, again, two tendencies that run counter. On one hand, you have Poland, at least under the liberal conservative Tusk, who believes we need to strengthen the European defense system, their own, of course, also as a first step. But in general, we need to more integrate. We need to become more also militarily efficient. And on the other hand, you have two neighboring states who are doing exactly the opposite. Yeah, so that actually drives this the European Union apart. Yeah, and how under these circumstances will you come to the decision whom to take in, even if it were a Montenegro? Yeah, and I'm actually also thinking it might be a good idea to have a very close look at who is most advanced in this process, and to say, okay, let's try. And I think this kind of staggered accession process would be necessary. I think that it is not, now it's still the formula, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. I think we should really see this accession as a step by step. And then immediately, once you have finished an important step, you get the benefits. You are already halfway in the European Union, and then maybe, and I'm a skeptic, of course, although I'm an optimist, maybe that would motivate the others, the neighboring countries to say, well, we have to also do something. Yeah. And here I see the weakness in the fact that civil society is in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, unfortunately, not that strong as it would be helpful to be. Yeah? Yeah. So the governments, parties, they always look for their own benefit. And then the status quo is usually better than any reform they take, because they see reform not as a win-win situation. They see reform actually losing something, losing power. Yeah, and this can only be dealt with in the country itself. Yeah. And here the civil society, I think, could play a very important role.
Okay, let's focus a bit on Kosovo and Serbia, because you were introduced into this subject the hard way, entering the war, and you were very sensitive to these issues. You were very knowledgeable. And went to actually villages that other people did not go during the war. You were here consistently and gave the real picture of what was happening. And Austria, with Albert Rohan and with yourself, was very highly represented in the international diplomacy, and your presence in Rambouillet was very well perceived by all parties, especially by the Kosovar delegation. At one point, you were involved in something that looked very shady, which was the land swap. What actually happened?
That's quite a question, because I still remember at a time when I was one of the few to actually voice some sort of a nod. Why not talk about partition? Yeah, I was really heavily criticized for this. And so I was in a way then in this kind of explanation mode. Yeah? And maybe it will need a couple of minutes to explain this, because I think this is very important, how my thinking went at a time. And of course, you remember that it was Mogherini then in charge of foreign policy, in charge of the European Union, which obviously had sort of launched this idea, and Hashim Thaçi.
Was it the parties themselves or Mogherini? Was it Thaçi and Vučić, or it was Mogherini?
Well, this I actually do not know. I think it was this was always a Serb idea. Yeah?
Yeah.
I think that really came from Belgrade as an idea. And Thaçi was obviously open to it, and obviously also Mogherini. Yeah? And when I heard this, I thought, oh, it's a bad idea. But it would be the first time that I can remember that two heads of state or government in the Balkans would try to talk about borders in a peaceful way, in a diplomatic, in a political way, and not fight it out on the Kosovo poly or any place. Yeah. So my thinking at the time was actually, it's unrealistic to believe that there is going to be a compromise, a territorial compromise hammered out. However, once you talk about it, and once both sides realize it's too difficult, let's find another solution to this, then we would be on the right way, that both sides would have a responsibility to be successful. And then you could say there is not a division, a territorial division, but we find a solution where people on both sides of the border can live a better life, economically, easier crossing the borders, actually the European idea, so to speak.
Even your personal life, because you were a Slovene, ethnic Slovene in Austria, right?
Yes, yeah. For me, clearly, this thinking was, I remember in times of Cold War, of course, as a young kid, I remember going to Yugoslavia was always very difficult, psychologically. What is the communists and here, and they might, when things were happening at the border and so on. And then when this all was over, all of a sudden we were all friends and we crossed back and forth. So this kind of feeling, it was more a feeling that I had, could also happen here. And of course, we had also Austria. We have Alto Adige, South Tyrol. Sure. Yeah, I mean, South Tyrol, for many, many generations, that was a huge problem. Yeah, starting World War I. 1918, there was the division. And then in the 1970s, so it took a very, very long time, but it eventually worked out. Yes. And of course, there were also plans to swap or to reintegrate Alto Adige or the South Tyrol into Austria, and all this, and there were even population transfer, during Hitler and Mussolini, German-speaking from Italians, they were resettled in Germany. I remember also from one part in Italy. I was actually in a family. My mother wasn't married at the time, and so there was a lady from Italy, German-speaking lady, who was my nanny at the time. I grew up with her. I still remember her with a lot of fondness. I saw what this kind of division can produce, and how, if turned in a positive way, things can then add to a better life.
And so how did this work out?
I even suggested to the Austrian president van der Bellen at the time, when we have in the Tyrol, in Alpbach, there's an annual
meeting,
summer European conference, and he invited Vučić and Thaci to this conference, and it was the first time that the two were on the same stage.
When they said we are not problematic guys, right?
Yeah. Okay. And we had dinner together, Okay. And I felt somehow that this is actually what my thinking was behind this this partition idea. Actually, they get to know each other better, and they also see the limits of what can be achieved, and then you move on from there.
Did you sit on maps?
No, it was not. That was, of course, not the case. But of course, I had this. I saw these unrealistic ambitions in Belgrade. I thought this could never work. So, but that was really my idea. It would not work, but they have at least tried.
And the idea was to get, what, 10 times more territory?
Well, I mean, the Serbs, of course, thought they could get much more than they would give. I mean, this is okay, but it can't work. It cannot work, but you can have a wish, of course, but it's wishful thinking, not reality. But for me, it was important also from yet another angle. Immediately when this partition idea came up, it was absolutely criticized that, no, this is a no-go. Why is this a no-go? Are we the ones to decide what two politicians from neighboring countries will maybe eventually decide? It's not up to us.
But then this idea went from Europe to the United States, right?
Yes. It's true. Of course, I mean, partition is not such an original idea. You think, okay, why not? I have heard this in Bosnia many times. That, I mean, Serbs cannot live together, so therefore, with the Bosniaks, so therefore, just basically, And of course, I mean, our ambition at the time was that we need to find a way so they can live together.
Yeah.
But when they talk about it and when they agree on something, then it's up to them. Because, first of all, Thaci probably thought, well, if there is some sort of agreement with Belgrade, it's only possible if Belgrade recognizes Kosovo. Because you cannot sign an international treaty without being recognized as a state. Yeah, so it would be an indirect recognition of Kosovo if eventually something would have happened to this effect. And my ideas already went much farther. I said, what about if there's no partition? Why don't you create some sort of a joint venture across the border, which exists in quite a few other circumstances and between countries, a free trade zone, or you have some mining enterprises there. Why not have a joint enterprise? Of course, I mean, it sounds a bit utopian, but again, this is actually what politics needs to do, think out of the box, try out new ideas. If you are stuck in one idea and you say only either or, you cannot really reach any satisfactory compromise. So therefore, talking about possibilities, options, ideas is already sort of loosening up the situation.
Sure.
Yeah, and that's actually what was behind, as I've spoken now quite long. I thought this is an entry into direct engagement between the two politicians.
Okay, so far we have tried everything on Kosovo, including talks on partition, and they have not functioned. And many things have been tried in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they have not functioned. And the only thing that has not been tried is to make these countries functional as they are, and then try to establish some kind of relations. But I think that we are now entering a period in which the next quarter of the century will be testing actually this under very intense pressure, as we said, from a new geopolitical world where we live. And this would probably be the time when I would offer to exchange roles and offer you, if you have any questions, so that we can continue for this last part of the conversation.
I would like to ask you, what would you, if you were the Prime Minister of Kosovo, what would you do in a situation like we have today with Trump and changing, so to speak, the whole world? The prime power that has actually created Kosovo is now saying goodbye. You are now on your own.
Yeah.
You're now with the Europeans. Yeah, a weak situation. A dramatically changed situation. How would you approach this situation?
Well, I don't think there's one way to it. I think we have to try to consolidate a multilateral approach. The first one is strategically we will still have to have and increase our relationship with the United States. Administrations come and go. But it will be very difficult to see the United States isolate itself into an island simply because of its geography, because of the way the world has functioned. The idea that the United States becomes just one of the other countries in the world does not sound to me to be functional. It can be tried, but it will not function. It will disrupt a lot of the global trade, about the global balances, etc. But ultimately, we will have to come to some sort of equilibrium. And that equilibrium will be represented by the United States as well. Now, that said, what we have now as a challenge as Europeans is to create a shared European security space that starts in Great Britain and that continues up to Ukraine and Turkey. And so the question for the Western Balkan countries is how do they integrate into the European shared security space? What do they bring into the space? And this is important for the Western Balkans because they have to think about the Western Balkans as a shared security space. We have to get into a historic period in which the Kosovo Albanians, or Kosovo does not fear from Serbia, Serbia does not fear from Croatia, people in Bosnia and Herzegovina don't fear that another war will start. We need to get into a part of our history in which we see peace as a shared endeavor. And this is, I think, what we need to be thinking about. The third element into this is how do you do this in a compressed period of time? Because we do not have the luxury of the past century in which you could say, oh, well, let's try this, let's try the other, etc. Somehow things will sort themselves out. Things will not sort themselves out. And I think what both Putin and Trump in very different ways and very different modes have been doing is giving a wake-up call to this continent to say, we cannot take things for granted anymore.
Yeah, that's a very general answer, and I must admit that more specific answers are not possible right now. Therefore, I believe self-reliance would be extremely important. How could Kosovo contribute under these dramatically changed circumstances to enhance the security of the region, of course, and thus contribute to the security of Europe? As now, as you said, rightly so,
Yeah.
the United States is withdrawing.
Well, the core of this is establishing a new relationship between Kosovo and Serbia. And the core of this region is also establishing a functioning democratic Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is I think both of these are somehow the pillars of stability of the Western Balkans. I think there will be a possibility. I don't think the situation in Serbia will be static as we see it now. It's a dynamic situation. We don't know what will happen and how it will happen, but we have to project a future. And I was talking to Natasha Kandic and about facing the past and about reconciliation. We have to think about a real possibility that in the next 5 years, we will lay flowers on the monument of the Meja massacre, that there will be a Serbian delegation that will come and say, look, let's do this jointly. This is not done in our name. And so even if it doesn't happen in 5 years, we have to start discussing about this possibility, because we cannot dismiss the possibilities. We cannot say this will not happen in our lifetime. No, it should happen in our lifetime. And if we start discussing about it, well, it will happen. It might happen in our lifetime.
Yeah, I mean, historical parallels are very important. And I think of France and Germany, of de Gaulle and Adenauer. Yeah. A reconciliation, actually, of course, it sounds good if you say people must meet. But if there is nothing coming from above, it also doesn't work. People usually are ready to move and to march much farther already than politics does. And I think the idea between in the reconciliation between Germany and France was really that the top brass, the top people took this decision. We shake hands.
Yeah, they did. Well, they did.
And now the question to you is, you as prime minister, or maybe president of this country, would you go to, I don't know, Mitrovica or meet whoever is prime minister or president in Belgrade and say, let's do it? I think of another example, Sadat, Egyptian President Sadat, going to Israel.
Yeah, it did not end well for Sadat.
It did not end well, I know.
No, but I know where you're heading.
Also for Djindjic, it didn't end well. So it's...
No, I think there needs to be a brave step. I think what is also needed to see is reality. And the reality is that the Franco-German reconciliation came because France and Germany acknowledged that the wars have ended. And so mentally, what needs to be happening in Kosovo, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina is to acknowledge that the wars have ended and that peace is not continuation of war with other means. We have to live in a peace which is trying to establish mutual relations, which war is not repeated. And so what leadership needs to show, and I think some things will have to develop in the next 5 years, is a joint acknowledgement that the wars have ended, that there's no way that they can return, that the aims of the wars and the driving forces of these wars, which was basically dehumanizing the other, basically showing that I have a superior right, my ethnicity has a superior right over the other. These driving forces, although they have been adopted now, unfortunately, in other parts of the world, are not going to solve our problem. Maybe we are far ahead because we have suffered more.
When I think of Franco-German reconciliation, there was one factor which was very important at a time, and this was, of course, the Washington's tutelage. Yeah. The Americans at a time, this kind of well-meaning hegemon, basically said, okay, now shake hands.
Yes.
Yeah. So who would this be in the situation now here in the Western Balkans?
Unfortunately,
the Americans are gone.
Yeah.
Maybe they come back. You never know.
Yeah.
Unpredictability is really what drives Trump. So it could also go in the opposite direction. Europeans are here, of course, but they are too weak. I should tell you, actually, I thought if you do not appoint a political heavyweight to deal with Ukraine, for example, it will not work.
Yeah.
In a way, this also applies to the region here. You need an Ahtisaari or someone like this to handle the situation. I really appreciate it. I like Mr. Sorensen, but the political gravitas is missing.
Yeah.
And I think this would be important now. That could be done, and this would be a political signal also that the European Union is acting geopolitically, but it is acting also politically. Yeah? That's missing. But who would that be?
I don't know. I would like to think in another form, in another metaphor. You use the metaphor of the benevolent hegemon, the United States. I am thinking about kids' bicycles with the side wheels. And I think what is happening both for Europe as a whole and for the Western Balkans and for Kosovo and Serbia is that the side wheels have been taken off. And now we are on two wheels only. And we have to learn to cycle. And we will see how this happens.
Well, in a way, this also applies to Europe. You
Yes.
know?
Yeah.
I mean, the American side wheel is taken away.
Yeah.
The Russians have eliminated the other side
With a grenade.
Yeah. So, I mean, in a way, there are parallels between the situation that Kosovo is in and that the European Union is in. Both are unfinished business in a way, unfinished whatever, states or whatever. And I think that's something where I would really hope that countries, smaller countries like Kosovo, of course, also Serbia. I mean, Serbia matters.
Yeah.
Serbia is still the largest country in the region. Yeah. But I don't see there this kind of responsibility for the whole region, other than suppressing or criticizing. This kind of positive mode that is missing and there I believe to reach out, and to see, okay, let's do something very different. At least, and I hope that maybe sometime we will have an opportunity to see you as the Prime Minister. And I'm not criticizing the current Prime Minister, but in general, this kind of resolve and also this kind of self-assurance that I'm not always only the victim. Yes, I have been the victim, but now I want to reach out. This kind of this German-French idea, I think something of this would do a lot also for Europe, also for Europe, a Europe which now is really in a situation which is absolutely noble. There is today, actually, in these days, you see the end of the post-war period, the end of American dominance in Europe, and in a way, clearly, there are lots of anti-American sentiments out there, have always been, well, now here we are.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang. It's been a pleasure meeting and discussing, and I hope we will have the opportunity to chat very soon again. Let me assure you that I'm not running for Prime Minister's job, and when you come here in fall, we will continue this conversation, I hope with better sentiments and details. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
I thank you, Veton.
Pikë përkrahet nga Flugër, Eriskom, Muji Auto Center.